Hey, it's Amy Brown from The Bobby Bones Show. Join me in supporting St. Jude Children's Research Hospital for a chance to win a trip to meet Megan Maroney at the 2025 iHeart Country Festival in Austin, Texas on May 3rd, hosted by Bobby Bones. We're going to hook you up with tickets, flights, hotel, food credits, and a meet and greet with Megan Maroney. Take action now to support St. Jude and help cure childhood cancer, and you're going to be entered for a chance to win. Visit iHeartCountryTrip.com to learn more.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 10th episode of Crime Over Wine, the only podcast with head-scratching true crime stories that are just better over a bottle of wine. I'm your host, Liam Collins, and this week my guest co-host is a nationally published award-winning journalist, documentary producer, and podcaster. He's also probably the most well-versed person in our story this week. So my guest co-host this week is Joseph Fenity. Hello, Joseph. How are you doing?
Liam, so awesome to be with you. This is my first ever wine crime podcast. So the fact that we're talking crime over wine is like a first for me. This is so cool.
Well, I am so honored that this is the first one. This is so cool.
I've had this, Liam told me that we were going to do this and we're going to talk about the Betty Willis case and we're going to do this podcast. And so he has this particular wine. I know you're going to talk about this, but my point is it's been sitting on my desk,
waiting, tempting everybody.
It's so tempting. That's a great way to get through the week. Put a bottle of like really great wine on your desk Monday and just have to stare at it all week, knowing that if you get your work done, you can, have, crime over wine.
All we need to get to Friday and then that bottle of wine. Hey, you know what? Maybe I'll start doing that. Just put that bottle of wine right in my desk and be like, you know what? Like, just have to get through this to-do list and then you're mine. You know what I'm saying?
Seriously. It's been calling out to me. I'm like, maybe I'll just call Liam like midweek and say, can we just record now? I want to open this one.
Excellent. Well, so Joseph is an independent journalist who has been published in Rolling Stone and LA Magazine, to mention a few. He has written extensively about some of the biggest names in music, but also some names you likely have never heard of before, which is a huge theme for the story we're going to tell you about today. He was published in LA Magazine for writing comprehensively and by far the most extensively about the story we are going to tell you about today.
I'm thrilled that I got to talk about this topic. This amazing soul singer no one's ever heard of, and by no one I mean no one, just like 5 people on the planet. And I'm so happy that we're finally getting to give this woman a voice, but it had to be comprehensive, right? Because no one else had. I had to dig from square one. You know how it is. You work in news. It's like lots of the time, it seems that by the time a story arrives, we have some pieces of it, together, and so we get to add on to that and look into more with this case, as you found out. It was like starting at square one. So,
and I'm glad you mentioned that because a lot of times, as and I'm guilty of this myself on this podcast, talking about stories that have all of this already pre-published work that I can work off of and kind of get leads from and go about it that way. But the stories that nobody's talking about, arguably need to be told even more so. And so, it was so refreshing to read through your article and, be able to get a very detailed approach on Betty Willis and on her story. And, I use a lot more sources, a lot of other sources than just your article. But I also, I could have written an entire episode just off of your article. So it's so great to see that even at square one, you were able to bring the story to light. But But before we even get there, I'm not going to waste a single extra second, Joseph. We have wine to drink.
That's crime. Let's also talk.
Right. Let's talk wine. I think that's really what the people want to hear. Let's just go for it. So this week we are drinking Mark West's Pinot Noir. The wine is aiming to find the balance between savor and spice. It has notes of caramel, vanilla, and toasted oak, while finishing with notes of dried cherries and brown spice. So what do you say we crack it open and go for it?
I've been waiting for this moment, all this hard work. We're going to do a toast to Betty, and everyone's going to find out how this tastes. They're going to find out who Betty is. It's so cool to have permission to have some fun while talking about some drama.
My bosses would never, ever, ever, ever let me talk about whatever I'm talking about over a glass of wine. So this podcast is my little excuse. You know what I mean?
You have got me feeling all kinds of nervous. I mean, here we are. You're at your house. I'm at my house, but I'm still I'm mixing news with a glass of wine. And I'm trying to look around.
I'm like, who's going to yell at me?
Right.
Well, cheers to you, Joseph.
Cheers.
Yes.
Thank you for having me on.
Coming on. I think we should transition now over to our story of the week. Joseph, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
Well, so this week we want to tell you a pretty sad story, one that goes to show you that one turn can make all the difference. We're talking about a person who clearly had her head in the clouds, ready to follow her dreams, but had those dreams snuffed out in more ways than one. And I'm going to be honest with you, there's no definitive ending to this story, not because of a complicated investigation by any means, but because of a delayed delivery of justice that is still playing out 5 years later. Today, we're going to tell you the story of Betty Willis, the soul singer. In the early morning hours of New Year's Day 2018, a woman is enjoying her first cigarette of the new year in Santa Ana, California, when she suddenly hears the terrifying sounds of a woman screaming for her life. The sounds were coming just over the wall that separated the woman's home from a small shopping plaza across the street. At first, the woman doesn't really seem to think much of these growing calls for help, but as they continue, she calls 911. Well, just a few minutes later, police come to the scene and are using the spotlight on top of their cars to cut through an unusually foggy night. They turn into the parking lot of this plaza and use their lights to reveal a terrifying scene, what is obviously a brutal sexual and physical assault in progress. The man takes off, pants still around his ankles, and police sprint after him, aware that they just caught this man in a violent rage, clear as day. Just a short while later, they arrest the man and tend to the woman who he was just found to be violently attacking. She is an older black woman, potentially homeless. She's pronounced dead at 4:34 a.m., just 20 minutes after the neighbor called police. Now, this seems to be a pretty clear-cut case. Even on the foggiest of nights, police quite literally found this man in the act. But it gets even clearer than that. That's because this whole attack was caught on camera. And Joseph, I'm hoping that you're able to explain how this all ended up working out.
Essentially, yes, you're right. There's a suspect who begins attacking this woman. She is sleeping, by the way, and this woman, like you indicated earlier, was living on the street, was homeless at the time, but she, I think it's not that simple. It's never that simple, right? And I think you think sometimes, oh, okay, so if you're homeless, you're homeless. No, you're homeless, and there's always more to the story. And one important note, I think, is that where she was found, where she was attacked, she had picked out that spot and actually sought out permission from a store owner. It's a fabric store. And she went up to the owner one day after closing hours, and she said, hey, I see that you have this, it's kind of cornered, right? So it's got, she can look out and she can see the intersection, but, back against the wall always makes you feel safer usually. So it's lit well, it has a security light that comes on at night. So anyway, you've got someone who is very mindful and very smart and very quick about knowing, since I am in an unhoused situation, making the best of it, finding, okay, what is a good corner? What is a good well-lit area? What is the smartest way the safest way to be in an unsafe world. So, so that's essentially it. It's a fabric store called La Amiga down in a beautiful fabric store, by the way, down in Santa Ana, California, in Orange County, like we said. And there's a security camera, there's a light, but then there's a bad guy too.
Yeah, well, and so and you described this very, very well in your article about how this all this commotion happens, and this business owner decides, oh well, let me just go see what's going on, and pulls it up on his screen, right? Because he has cameras all around, recording that whole area. Can you tell me a little bit about how that came to be in terms of the relationship that she had with this business owner, and how what evidence he relayed to police?
This zip code, let's just be honest, this neighborhood and this zip code, it does get rowdy from time to time. There are noises and things and sirens and maybe someone yelling at someone else or whatever.
Right.
So to her, a little bit of commotion is normal. And, we've all lived in those cities, or we've all heard about those cities where it's like, okay, certain noises go, okay, there's just some little scuffle or some little thing. Essentially, that owner that Betty Willis had befriended and sought his permission to be out front of his business after hours, which he, by the way, in some ways kind of appreciated, because she was able to give him a full report every morning, right? So it's like, oh, this happened, that happened, or someone tried to park here, so they built this little, kind of I think the best way to describe it is a bit of a friendship. And he gets a call, this fabric store owner, he gets a call, I think it's coming up on 5 a.m., Liam, and it's like from Santa Ana PD, and he picks it up, and he and his family have owned this store since his father came here from Mexico, and they, became business owners. And so he owns a store, and it's like, dispatches on the other end, and they're like, something's happened. A huge crime has happened at your fabric store, and we need you down there to help us out. And he's like, oh, is it like a fire, or was there a fight in the parking lot? Or was there a fire? And they said, we think someone's died. So he, again, this is Betty's friend at this point. He, you know where your mind's going to go. Someone died in the parking lot. Who's the one person,
right?
So he goes, thanks to technology, he goes and he says, okay, I'm on my way. He goes and pulls up on his iPhone or on his smart device. He pulls up, he has 4 different camera angles. I know that DA is going to be irritated that I have all this, but anyway, 4 different, and by have all this, I mean not the video, I mean just the fact that there are 4 cameras, just to be clear. Okay. But there are 4 different camera angles. And he pulls it up on his phone, and he sees where Betty is supposed to be, and Betty is not. As in, and he sees activity, and he sees, police tape going up, and he, heads out
together, right?
Yeah, and heads out to the shop pretty quickly. Heads out to the store pretty quickly at that point.
And I think the linchpin here is this was a location that she picked because this was where she felt she would be okay, right? I mean, it was like you mentioned, it was a well lit area. She knew about the cameras, right? So she knew if anything bad happened, that it would at the very least be picked up, and that someone would know about it. And I think that's a really important note here,
right?
Of course,
a very and also very much, Liam, like on top of that, like it just kind of helps you describe and understand this person, right? Because it's like, not everyone's that detail oriented. She was.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think there's this certain connotation that comes with being homeless or being unhoused or experiencing homelessness, and of someone who is just making poor decisions. And I think that this really shows that Betty was being smart, was regardless of what her circumstances were, was clearly very cognizant of the fact that she needed to, if she was going to be living on the streets, needed to select a place that was going to provide some level of protection for her.
Right. Just like when those of us who are housed, just when we pick out houses, we pick out certain things, right? I want this, I want that, I want that. It's the same. I mean, I know some people may be sort of rolling their eyes, but honestly, it's sort of the same thing. It's just, in life, we've all got different situations. And, in Betty's case, you and I have a lot more in common with Betty than I think, initially meets the eye or meets the judgmental mind. It's like, yep, she was just picking out a good spot to be safe and to lay down. And so yeah, that was January 1st, 2018. That was, so now we're up to 5:30 a.m. or so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the man police arrest is identified as Rosendo Zoe Peck. He was a 22-year-old immigrant from Guatemala. He's charged with murder with an enhancement for it taking place during a sexual assault. As for the woman he's accused of killing, initial reporting on the first murder of 2018 strictly identified her as an elderly Black homeless woman, but police end up identifying her as 76-year-old Betty Willis. And true music lovers everywhere immediately recognize that name. The headlines shift from homeless woman brutally raped and murdered to identifying her for the life that she lived. A soul singer known for songs like Act Naturally and Someday You'll Need My Love.
Oh, it just makes me so... I'm glad I'm having wine with you, Liam. Mm-hmm. I wish we could have Betty here sitting next to us, but I think in some ways we do. Because just hearing you say... I love hearing it out loud. Songs like Act Naturally and Someday You'll Need My Love. Go look it up, everyone. But I'm so happy to hear you talk about Betty's music. It's so cool, bringing it to life. There was an old song, Act Naturally. Buck Owens did it. Go, Bakersfield Sound. They're going to put me in the movies, that whole thing.
Right.
And I think it was Phil Spector, Leon Russell for sure. They wanted to do like a retooled kind of soul version of it. Like, let's get a real strong Black voice to make Act Naturally not a kind of buckaroo kind of country song. Let's change it up.
Right.
And that's what Betty did. And so unfortunately for Betty, the Beatles decided to do Act Naturally. So I don't think hers got as much attention as it could have or should have, because when you're up against the Beatles, you only have
you don't stand a fighting chance. Yeah,
right. Exactly. And so it's like, but the really there's not much good that comes out of this story, with the exception of what Betty was trying to do back in the 1960s when she was recording these songs, Act Naturally, Someday You'll Need My Love, and Gone with the Wind Is My Love, is another one out there. She was trying to get people to hear them, and not enough people did hear them back then. It should be pointed out, if anyone's trying to kind of get a visual of Betty or of her music, or of her as an artist, Betty was from the same era. And by the same era, I mean like the same exact year as Aretha Franklin. Both Betty and Aretha were born the same year. Obviously the same age. They recorded music around the same time, the early 1960s. Unfortunately, they both died the same year at the same age too, at 76. So they had very similar paths. Both came from the South. Both left the South at the age of 2. And again, it's part 2 of the podcast where it's like, how do some people make it and others don't? Why do some people make it and others don't? But yes, if you haven't heard the name Betty Willis, that's totally normal at this point, but once you hear her voice and once you guys look up and listen to some of these songs, you're going to go, oh, wow, here's another great voice I need to add to my list.
Yeah. And, I'm so glad you brought up Aretha Franklin, because I think that is so important to keep in mind here, just in terms of the different paths that two people can take who intended to take the same path, and that's I think that's really crucial here. But this news about Betty's death shocked the music scene. I mean, how did an ambitious, talented young artist turn into a woman living on the streets, the same streets where she spent her final moments? To understand that, you have to go back quite a bit. And so Joseph and I are going to go all the way back to the humble beginnings of what started off as what looked like a promising music career. Betty Willis was born on March 10th, 1941 in Sunflower County, Mississippi, just east of Greenville and northwest of Jackson. From a young age, she was a music lover through and through, a record collector, and a regular at training her developing voice. By the early 1940s, she was moving out to California with her family, which, Joseph, appeared to be a pretty budding place for young artists, especially Black artists, right?
Yep. You look at what was happening at that time in the country, what was happening at that time in the South, and as well as or what was happening in music at that time. And I've got something exciting I want to share about this time frame and about Betty's history in Mississippi that I just want to add here. And I think it's also because I had this Mark West wine, but I just went down.
A little loose.
Yes. Are you ready for the breaking news? I just went down to Mississippi and I met with one of her producers, someone who used to produce Betty and worked on Betty's music. So stay tuned, because as you mentioned Mississippi, it got me excited because I just went down there to kind of follow up on, kind of the conclusion of Betty's story. Isn't it fun to kind of have a county called Sunflower County too? Like I've never.
That is kind of, I did it. So you told me about that. And that was, I think that is really fun. That is probably the most Mississippi thing I think I've ever heard.
Yep. Right. Yep. Sunflower County. But yeah, this was, so this time frame, like you said, we're at the beginning of the 1940s. Betty's a little girl. Her family, like so many families at that time, were heading, again, I compared it with Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin, they went east. The Franklin family went east. Betty, the Willis family, they went west. And that's where Betty's family, I think a lot of their background was in farming and agriculture. So they went kind of, for those who are familiar with the terrain of California and the regions of California, they really went kind of like kind of Fresno area, kind of where there was a lot of farming in Central California. That's where they first kind of landed before kind of heading up to Southern California, the California that we all hear about all the time. So that's how Betty kind of, she and her family got west.
Well, so Betty eventually found her footing and found her people too. She started performing in clubs and took opportunities to record with some pretty big names, even recording an unreleased duet called My Tears Will Go Away with Bill Medley, who would eventually find fame as half of the Righteous Brothers. But inarguably, her most famous song was called Act Naturally, and we're going to play just a short clip for you of it right now.
Isn't that awesome? Isn't that just a voice where it's like, how have I not heard this voice? And how tragic that it, sometimes you don't hear about certain people in this world until they're gone.
Yeah, and that You're Gonna See Me in the movie is just, breaks my heart, because it's like, we never saw Betty in the movies, and it's like, maybe we could have if she had, the right support system or the right chance to make that happen. And it just, it's all in hindsight, and it just makes me very sad. And that voice too. She had such an incredible, powerful voice.
Yeah.
That cuts through.
Yeah. Betty didn't get a movie, and we'll talk in a moment about how she, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of people who've looked at this case, has yet to have gotten respect. Right. So, by the end of this, you and I will be requesting RESPECT and everyone singing along for RESPECT for Betty.
Well, so by the mid-1960s, Betty's career just hadn't taken off, and then she found herself pregnant, and she gave birth to her beautiful baby girl, who she named Stephanie. But like so many single parents, she realized that she had to trade in a far-reaching, maybe impractical dream for something more stable for the sake of her child. So by the mid-1970s, Betty's recording schedule was next to empty, and she got a job at the U.S. Post Office.
Yeah. So we all know those moments in life. We've all had those moments where it's like you've got the really good job, or you've got the really good gig, or you've got the thing that you love to do, and then you have to go do a job that is not what was on your vision board. Right. If Betty had a vision board, I know, with all due respect to the great U.S. Postal Service, that, the Postal Service.
That wasn't the dream.
No,
that wasn't the dream.
No, it's on very few people's radar as the dream, I guess.
She clearly wanted to make it in music. She clearly wanted to make art. So this was very much so
had to pay the bills.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah. So she got to this point in her life where it's like, okay. And of course, a baby came along. So it's like, all right, I've got to be a responsible mom
Changes
here.
everything, right?
You know, it's like I've got to, if like you just mentioned, her schedule of recordings and performing was no longer there. So it's like, well, that's not there. I need money and I need to raise my kiddo here. So, all right, let's go see who's hiring. Postal Service is hiring. So she, got a day job and began a career with the United States Postal Service. And she was down at a, again, going from like recording at Hollywood, and at, with names like Phil Spector and Leon Russell and all the things that come along with a Hollywood recording session. Hollywood recording sessions.
People who, artists would dream of recording with back in the day, right?
Exactly. Even just once, once going to what was, some of your listeners will know, Gold Star Studios. That's, the Wall of Sound. And so she's now in Santa Ana at the Postal Service and, has been working there for a little while. And then comes along, like I said, you'd be a great male person. I could still see it. But then comes along someone who is a little like you, a little like me. This kid named Anthony, a little bit younger than us though. This kid named Anthony.
Thanks for that.
He's 18. but if it makes you feel better, he's way older than us now. But this young guy. So what you have is this new character entered into the story. And honestly, if it weren't for this 18-year-old at the time, we're talking 1980, right? So she kind of wrapped things up in the 70s with music. And by 1980, she is at the Postal Service. So is Anthony, a young 18-year-old kid who has also decided to get a summer job. And so Betty moved on, right? It's like, okay, moving on. And remember, back then, we have to consider, and you weren't alive back then, neither was I, but it's not like now. Like after you and I do this podcast, I can email you or text you and say, hey, can I have a copy? Or hey, can you show me this or give me a link or whatever? Back then, you didn't get copies of stuff, especially if you were up and coming, right? It's just like, hey, we'll let you know if it gets released. We'll let you know if we even release it under your name. We'll let you know what your name is. We'll let you know if, so time marched on. And so again, Post Office Betty got Post Office Anthony. But Anthony is not, this 18-year-old is not just any, he's the youngest guy at this post office in Santa Ana. And he's also, and you guys are going to love this, so grab your wine if you're listening, he's also a record collector. He's a music lover. The Walkman had just come out like within 6 months of what we're talking about right now. So Betty Willis had a Walkman, by the way. And so Anthony's looking at his coworker at the post office, Betty, this woman he's just met. And he's like, oh, so cool. She has a Walkman. And of course, again, now we know how Betty survived the Postal Service. She's probably listened to some really cool tunes. Right. It's like, that's how you get through.
We've all been there. We've all been there. We've all had that job.
Yes. So. It's like, just put on your blinders and go.
Right.
So, but Anthony is interested in having a conversation. While Betty may be able to drown out the noise of the boringness and the mundaneness of the U.S. Postal Service, Anthony, on the other hand, Liam, he's like, I don't know, probably like would be you and me if you and I had met at the post office and no one was talking. You and I would find a way to have some 15-minute coffee chats or wine.
I usually do.
So Anthony's like, he's trying to make conversation, and he gets teamed up with Betty one week, and they're sorting mail and doing all this, horribly boring stuff. Let's just be honest. It's work that needs to be done, but God, this is like pre-machines too, or at least the machines they have now where they needed more hands-on stuff. So they're doing this boring, mundane kind of stuff, and Anthony's just kind of like losing it. He's like, I need someone to talk to. So he finally starts making conversation with Betty. He does his best to strike up a conversation with Betty, and it's just not clicking, as in Betty wants to get the job done and get home and clock out, right? Well, finally, Anthony hits on a topic that perks up Betty's interest, and he says, I've got a music collection. I collect records. And she goes, really? Wow. good. Okay. Well, and she finally told him, she said, I used to record records. And he goes, really? Now I'm sure no work is getting done. Don't tell the post office. Now it's just set aside.
Nobody's getting their mail in Santa Ana that day. No one.
No one got their mail that day. It's like, wait, you did right? What do you mean? What'd you do? And she said, well, I used to record this and that. And he says, well, sing me one of your songs. She's like, no, don't worry about it. He says, no, I want you to sing. Come on, sing me one of your songs. She's like, you wouldn't have ever heard of it. And he goes, try me. That's when she sings the song Liam just played, the Act Naturally song. They're going to put me in the movies. They're going to make a big star out of me. All I got to do is act naturally. Well, so Betty starts singing this. So again, we've gone from a woman wearing her Walkman headphones. Betty was also known to wear her shades indoors. So, she had her sunglasses on and stuff. So now we've got sunglasses off, right? We've got like Walkman headphones. We called them headphones back then. They weren't earbuds yet. She got her headphones off, and the conversation, which looked to all of us as if we had been there, it looked like this conversation not going to happen. Now it's like a karaoke fest, American Idol back at this post office in Santa Ana, California. And so suddenly Anthony joins in and starts singing. And it's like, all I got to do is act naturally. It's just like, oh my God, what happened? And so then Betty, according to Anthony, and you guys can read about this in the LA Magazine article, but Anthony tells me that midway through, Betty stopped singing. And so he's still, he's on a roll. This 18-year-old kid, he's like, all I got to do is act naturally. And then he's like, wait a minute, why'd you stop singing? And so now Betty's shades are now down by her nose and she's looking at him very suspiciously. And she's like, what's going on here? How do you know that song? And that's when he goes, oh my God, wait, you're Betty Willis. You're Betty Willis. And she goes, yeah, and what's your point? I mean, can you imagine if I came up to you in the newsroom and I'm like, you're Liam Collins. You're like, yeah. You're Liam Collins. Yeah, what's your point? So that's the moment that everything changed, where Anthony recognizes, you're Betty Willis. And she goes, what are you talking about? Of course I'm Betty Willis. What's your point? And that's when he says a few words that will change the life of these two people forever. When he says to her, I have your record. That's where the friendship began. He went home on his break, by the way, like they weren't already taking a break, let's be honest. But Anthony goes home on his break. He doesn't live far from the post office, Liam. He goes home and he actually gets his Betty Willis Act Naturally single, and he takes the record to her. And so the friendship between Betty and Anthony begins that day in the early 1980s.
You can't see this, but I have chills all up and down my arm. And, it's partly because this is such a beautiful moment, but it's also, a little bit of hindsight, right? Knowing, what happens to Betty, 20 years from then, 30 years from then, that's just so
But
magical.
even then, and I know, and Liam, even if it stopped right there, and even if it ended in a happy way, even if it just stopped right there, it still gives you chills because you want to be able to have those moments in life where you go, do your own thing, you move on to whatever is next, but someone says, hey, I remember you from whatever, whether it was you were really nice to me in first grade, or you were my favorite teacher, or you're my favorite weatherman, or whatever. It's like, it's so cool when people can circle back and go, I know. So it gives me chills every time I talk to people about this story, they say, did this really happen?
Right.
Like, I know.
Yeah.
Sounds like a movie.
Well, and it's also, so we're talking about the 80s, and she stopped singing, right? And, probably like 10, 15 years before that. And, I can just imagine Betty, just putting that life behind her, but then seeing this kid who probably, wasn't even born, or like just barely born, right? When she stopped
and more
singing.
Enthusiastic than she,
right? Yeah. I mean, that's just incredible, to have this minor, at least in hindsight, career in singing, but have such an impact on this person who remembered your name. It could have just been like, wow, that sounds kind of familiar, but he remembered her name, and that is incredible. Yeah, man. And she couldn't believe it. Yeah, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Of course she can. I mean, can you? Someone can, and this is not. They're not at a studio. They're not at a record store. They're not even at a birthday party.
they're at the 9 to 5, which by the way came out that same year too. I was looking at this stuff. I was like,
well,
what was that?
Most of my listeners are in Tennessee, so you're talking to the right people here.
Tumble Out of Bed, Stumble the Kitchen was out that year. That movie was out that year. That's what we're talking. We're talking about the Jane Fonda, Lily Tomlin, Dolly Parton year at the movies. So that's the year that it happened. So yeah, it was just a moment, and so
beautiful moment.
So that's when they first met at the post office. Those two people, and you guys will hear in a minute how Anthony comes into play here. But
Anthony's not over yet, and the rest of Anthony's story is absolutely beautiful. So stay tuned for that. But this is when Betty's life gets about as foggy as the night she was killed back in 2018. Somehow, after she retired from the post office, Betty ended up homeless and living on the streets by the 90s. And Joseph, this is when I feel like her life takes a bit of a sad turn, because you see pictures of her and you see so much joy and so many dreams, that beautiful smile she has, and it seems to me like, as odd as it sounds, becoming unhoused was not only somewhat of a choice for her, but also maybe even like a circumstance of the dreams that she never got the opportunity to chase.
Yeah and the thing is, I've learned a lot working on the Betty Willis story. Not only have I learned a lot about Betty and the justice system, and some days a lack of a justice system, which I know we'll get to, but I also learned I thought I knew what homelessness was, just as a person who's not experienced it, of course. I'm someone who, I know what it means to fall on hard. I understand. I guess I can't say understand. I get that people are going through stuff. I get that things happen. But you don't get it, because it kind of bothered me a little bit when I saw the headline that said homeless woman murdered, because it's always more than that. Yeah. And it's and Betty might have been unhoused. Betty might have been homeless. That's not the point of the story. And Liam, you could appreciate this as a fellow journalist. You want more to the story. So Betty did get to a point in her life, though, like you said, where she just, and this kind of goes back to what I was trying to hint at here, Liam, is that she kind of just didn't really trust life. Too many things had kind of like not worked out. And so I think that's part of what led her down a road of like, you know what, I don't want to have these rules or restrictions, or can't trust a landlord. I don't want to sign another paper. I don't want to sign another agreement. I don't want another lease. Again, that can't be all of it, but that's got to be some of it. Someone who had been let down by life too many times. So, that's where in the late 90s, after the post office, where Betty ended up, she took early retirement, and, things just didn't work out with housing, with, stuff. We'll never know the exact details when it comes to that part of Betty's life.
Well, and so, I also know, just again from reading what you've written about this, is that she still had her daughter. She still had Stephanie, who at this point, I believe, had children of her own. Right. My understanding too is, she was still actively a part of Stephanie's life, of her grandchildren's life. Can you talk to me a little bit about what that relationship was like too?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that's the other part that I think is a real great thing for people to know and to learn. Like, Betty still went and got her nails done. Betty still went and visited with her grandkids and loved and adored her grandkids. Betty still had a relationship with her daughter. Her daughter would come pick her up and they'd go do things. And again, I know some of you guys are sipping on your finer wine, trying to wrap your head around, right? Just like, wait, where would you pick her up? At the park? At the bus? Yes, because that's where Betty wanted to be. It's not, and for anyone out there going, well, I don't understand it. It's okay. It's not really for you to understand. No, not at all. It's not always our department, right? But the nights always ended the same. The day would always wrap up the same, where it's like, hey, come on, Mom, come. Her daughter Stephanie would often encourage her, come stay with us for a little while. Come, no, just drop me off at my spot. Let me do my own thing. Let me be Betty and the way that I want to be Betty this decade. Let me do that. So, but you're right, and I'm so glad you brought that up, Liam. She still maintained those family days and those things that we think, well, wait, is that what someone who's unhoused does? course.
Yeah.
Why not? Some of them, yeah.
Well, and I think there's something to be said too about, we've all met those people who didn't want to be too much of a burden on people, or, didn't want to sacrifice their freedoms that they've had.
Exactly. And it's like, well, if you live on your own at this point, you're going to have to blah, 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 or you won't get this or that. It's like, yeah, but I'm still going to be on my own. And that's what so many of us want. And we all have the right to do our own thing. And Betty, and I talked to some producers and some engineers that she worked with back in the music days, Liam. And back when she was singing, Betty did her own thing, and you hear it in her voice. And, in her final decades, when she wasn't doing music, Betty was still had her own mind. Betty had her own independent mind of what she wanted to do and how she wanted to do it.
Yeah. Well, that is more or less what we know about Betty Willis, about how she lived her life leading up to her tragic and untimely death, which brings us back to New Year's Day 2018, the first day in what would be a slow turning of the wheels of justice. So we've just about reached the point in this story where you get involved and write about Betty in LA Magazine, which really elevates her story to the point where it needs to be. And it's this really compelling read that just tugs at the heartstrings and brings you right to the front of this investigation. But I'm wondering if you could explain how you heard all about Betty's story and also what made you want to tell it.
It's first off, thanks for saying that. The whole goal was to elevate Betty's story. The whole goal was to get Betty's voice out there because it wasn't. So the whole point was because I thought that the headline, there was so much more to the headline. And we talked earlier about homeless woman murdered. And I think that, at the time that Betty's story came out, it wasn't long after that I was visiting Detroit for the very first time. And when I was landing in Detroit, the big headline was Aretha Franklin memorial service. And I don't know if you guys remember, because I know it aired somewhere, multiple places, and it was like this, multi-hour, every single person was there, this celebration of life. And it was like this soul singer who was on all of our minds and in all of our hearts and on all of our soundtracks and our parents' soundtracks and our playlists.
Right.
And there was a huge celebration for this woman's life after 76 years. And I couldn't, and it was 2018. I was landing in Detroit, Motown itself. And I was like, wow, I wish that there could be more of a celebration for everyone's life. And now we don't all get Aretha Franklin level celebration. She deserved that, But I also believe that a lot of us, don't or won't get, that even halfway there with the celebrations. And I wish we could. And so I think somebody said, well, why are you doing this Betty story? And I, without even thinking, when you have those snap reactions and you just say something out loud, my immediate reaction that I said out loud was because no one else is. And it was really nice to hear that when it came out of my mouth real fast as kind of a comeback comment, but it was the truth because no one else is. I felt very sincerely and very strongly that Betty Willis was being ignored. I perceived her story and parts of her life to be overlooked and ignored. And so that's what really attracted me to it. And I think Aretha, thanks to Aretha, she kind of, put it over the top because I'm like, okay, now I've got these Aretha headlines. And again, they passed away the same year. It was like, okay, we've got to talk. We've got to do something to elevate and spotlight this unheard voice. So that's what attracted me to it because no one else was doing it.
Yeah,
I'm like, I have to get out there, I have to do it.
That's incredible. And, I think that's so important, and that's where, a good journalist comes in is, doing something that, isn't being told by everybody. It's being told by, a very unique person. So I think that's really cool. So thank you so much for sharing that. So turning back to Rosendo Peck, in his arrest warrant, police write that he had taken a blanket off of a sleeping Betty before he sexually assaulted her. They also say he punched her in the head multiple times and choked her when she screamed for help. The maximum sentence Rosendo could face for that enhanced murder charge is life in prison without the possibility of parole. And he pleads not guilty. But Joseph, there is some pretty indisputable evidence in this case. Am I right about that?
You're absolutely right. So remember why Betty wanted this spot, this what she perceived to be a safe or safer spot. It's because it was well lit, and it's because it had a camera. I later found out at least 4 cameras. The cops roll up on this scene, and this guy, you read the police report, and I know you're going to share my website later, but josephfenity.com/Betty. If you go there, you can look at the police report and the narrative, and this guy was literally caught with his pants down. So again, we're going to talk in a moment about how the case is still pending. Can you believe that? 5 years over. I've been on this case for 5 years. And, but the suspect is seen by 2 Santa Ana police officers. This drives me wild that we are 5 years down the road. 5 years down the road. This is where I'm mostly a journalist, but I think anyone in 2023 is kind of an activist, all of us. And so the activist in me is going, wait a minute, why are we 5 years down the road? You've got, Liam asked here about evidence. Liam asked about witnesses. Liam asked about case. Like, what, is it strong? You got 2 guys who rolled up on this, not just 2 guys, 2 police officers on duty on the force. They've been dispatched by 911. Why? Because a woman cried out for what? Help. Then what? Well, then you have camera surveillance footage. You got the surveillance footage. Santa Ana PD goes in. Investigators go in. They successfully retrieve the camera footage. Maybe up to 4 cameras. 4 cameras were installed there at the time. So they've at least got a few of those cameras. So they've got this footage. Now, in the words of my grandmother, what seems to be the problem? It's like, what is the holdup here? So that's kind of where, I've had friends and colleagues ask me, hey, what's latest on the Betty case? And I have nothing to tell them. I've done my work for the most part. I've done my research. We're now at a standstill because we're now waiting on the Orange County, the justice system, California, Orange County's district attorney.
Well, and I've seen, cases tried with less, literally, quite literally, like you said, he was caught with his pants down. I mean, he was caught on camera with all of this. I mean, it would seem to me anyways, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an investigator, but it seems to me like the clearest cut case that you can possibly get.
Well, and it is indisputable. I mean, again, you're not in law enforcement. You're not, an on-scene investigator. I don't investigate crime scenes, but no rocket science required here. This is one of those cases where I think what you've likely concluded based on what you've read and what you've seen and what we've discussed, the facts, based on what the investigation and the investigators involved have leaned towards. I mean,
caught in the act, right?
Yeah. So, 99.9% of crime over wine listeners probably agree that this guy's up to something, and in the defense of the district attorney and you want things to be solid and tight and bulletproof. So I guess that's where they're coming from. They want this to be perfect. They obviously maybe know things that we don't know that hasn't been publicly made available. But I will add one other note here, just a side note, a reporter's note. It's not going to stay airtight and bulletproof and perfect the way that they want if if you have me and others, if you're not going to do the work. Right. If I'm going to come have crime and talk about the wine, you've got to get the show on the road. If, time is of the essence, I believe. Right. And everyone's got a right to justice. And, Betty has a right to speedy justice. This suspect has a right to a speedy trial. So anyway, that's where we are.
Well, and I think that's a great point. And I think, that lands us pretty well of where we are in the story in terms of like, you would think that a crime that not only police encountered in progress, but one that was caught on camera would have justice more than 5 years later. But you would think wrong. At this point, at least on paper, prosecutors appear to be trying the case against Rosendo Peck. He has a whole bunch of court hearings on his online record, and it reads like a bad Tinder profile. There are about 60 canceled and postponed dates. The court system delayed his trial at least 3 times, from what I can tell, over the last 5 years. Joseph, you reported that he has had at least 6 different public defenders assigned to this case over the last 5 years, which is just insane to me. Like, what is your understanding for what this big holdup is here?
Geez, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. Even if I did know, it would probably just frustrate us even more, because it's like, okay, there was a request, and this hasn't been covered very much at all, but there was a request to possibly deported, I guess is the right phrase. But yeah, but they looked at some point early on in this case, they were looking at, hey, can we get this guy back to his home country of Guatemala? And maybe just for his protection, maybe he, but here's the deal. So in terms of what's holding it up, this guy has a whole lot of rights now that he has landed here in this country and in a place that, affords people in this country who, whether you're a citizen or not, we don't know this particular suspect's legal status, by the way, but whether he is a documented person or not a documented person, whether he is whatever anyone's story is here in America, once you're here, you've got some protections. And so first, we had some relatively legit delays, especially here in Southern California. That was that thing we all know as COVID-19. So we had the COVID delays.
What's that?
So yeah, what was that again? That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Is that a wine? What was that?
Yeah, right.
So we've got that legit excuse there of like, okay, public health, public safety, delaying this, Zoom meetings, whatever. But like any excuse, legit or otherwise, it can only last so long. So you've got the COVID delays, fine.
Well, but then let's pause here and remember that this guy was arrested January 1st, 2018, 2 years before COVID. So, I mean, that excuse, I feel it can only go so far, but continue.
So then we go through 2020, then we get through 2021 and 2022. And you've got a situation where the suspect, and Liam's asked here about delays. So the suspect, he says that he does not speak English. He also says he does not speak Spanish. What this leaves us with, there's an ancient Mayan dialect that he speaks, that he understands. So that's where we are. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, not because I'm psychic, but because we've been here before, right? But it's, are you sure he doesn't understand either of those languages? Well, here's what I understand. What I understand, and Liam, I think I've shown you this report, but you've got the initial police report, which indicates that this suspect, Rosendo Peck, he was pulled in for the murder of Betty Willis in 2018, and he was interrogated. So there's this police station interview, when they take you downtown, that kind of thing. Right. That interrogation lasted for 45 minutes, over 40 minutes of a conversation about something.
Well, and I believe if I remember correctly, that interview was conducted in Spanish, correct?
That's right. Yeah, so they brought in someone highly trained, highly bilingual in English and Spanish. And, from bits and pieces, and I can't talk about all of this part just yet, but from bits and pieces that I know from the scene of the crime that day at the fabric store, it was indicated to me that the suspect was, quote, very clear on the instructions and very clear. That's something I got from someone on the scene. It was very clear that he understood the initial conversation. So you've got a language barrier, allegedly, or otherwise. You got a language barrier. You've got a little bit of a COVID barrier. You have a justice system that, I don't know, is Betty that important? I've been trying to get to the bottom of that. I don't think anyone's ever going to give me a straight answer on that. But, is there something about our justice system or our country that sees certain victims as more important than other victims?
Well, and if we can pause the only because I feel like it's important to note, all the different, intersections of people that we're talking about here. We're talking about someone who is presumed to be homeless, talking about someone who's elderly, and talking about someone who's African American. So I'm sure all of those factors did not play into her favor here. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding of it.
So like Orange County, when you hear about Orange County, it's there's a certain thing that goes along with it. But it's a county that has a lot of, it's not just Anaheim, it's not just Disneyland, it's not just essentially, I think that you leaning into the fact that Betty was a woman of color. Betty was not a housed woman. Betty was what we call homeless. It's like when this reached the desk, and I don't know, but when it reached the desk of, a district attorney's office, did they see this as a priority or not? I think they would probably argue, well, it doesn't matter. Everyone deserves justice.
Right.
Well, I'd like to believe that too.
Well, and also, because I always think about, and I think this is the most bogus, elected position on the face of the planet is the district attorney, because I don't understand why that person needs to, appeal to people's votes. But that's a different podcast probably. But point being,
interesting point though. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what, because, I think that compels a certain type of person, and not every district attorney, but certainly a certain type of person to, want to appeal to that sexy headline. And certainly, elderly Black homeless woman gets murdered isn't one of them.
Well, yeah. And, here's the deal. I went to the district attorney's office in Orange County. And the only reason I went there, because you know how reporting is these days, especially if it's print or online, you don't have to physically show up to certain places, believe it or not, because everything's, accessible. But after, 6 or 9 months of lack of email responses and lack of voicemail and phone responses, you have to head out of, shiny Hollywood and go down to Santa Ana, California and say, hey, did you get my email? And I did.
Right.
I had to go there and kind of like, I don't know. It's like pulling teeth. And my dad's a dentist. I know what pulling teeth is like. It's not this hard.
Well, and you wrote so you wrote so very detailed about that in your article too. So I suppose maybe I'll savor that part of this part of the story for people who are interested in reading more about that, because I read that, and that's the point of the article after you had wrote to me asking me to have you onto this podcast. When I was like, oh yeah, let's talk about this. So, just moving on, to the slow moving wheels of justice, in this case, no doubt, absolutely. But there is some hope that Betty's case, her life and her story is heard by more than just a couple of journalists and podcasters, but you will need to be the ones who make sure it is. The good news is that Rosendo does have a trial scheduled. The Orange County court system is going to put him in front of a judge on April 14th of this year. But that hasn't stopped the criminal justice system from delaying this case before, and we have no reason to believe it won't happen again. So if you care about Betty, like Joseph, and like I have come to care about Betty since Joseph first reached out to me about telling her story, you can put pressure on the prosecutors and the judges to finally put the legal system to the test in this case and let a jury decide what to do with Rosendo. If you want to see that too, call the Orange County District Attorney's Office and tell them that you care about Betty's life. That number is 714-834-3600. You can also email the office, and we are also going to put that number and that email in the link to our show notes.
I'm so glad you're doing that, Liam. And also, it means a lot when you said that the story made you care, and that's the whole point, right? If you can walk away from this podcast going, oh, I know a little more about this great artist, this great woman, and just, that's the goal. So I'm glad that, I think, God, if we can just get a few more people to know
absolutely
about Betty's case, it's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, Betty's life may be over, but I can't help but feel like her story is far from it. And frankly, if anything good has come out of this incredible delay of justice in Orange County, California, it's that we're still talking about Betty 50 years after she last entered a recording studio and 5 years after she died in one of the worst ways imaginable. But an artist's work doesn't die with them, even when it seems like they gave up on that dream a long time ago. One of the most tragic parts of this story that I felt to my very heart was the extreme passion Betty clearly felt for creating music and her dreams to have that be what defined her life. You can see it in every picture of Betty from the earlier parts of her life. Her face is bright, full of life, laughter, and hope. But that dream died, whether it was of her own accord or not. And I'm struck by the lyrics of her most well-known song, Act Naturally, as a reminder of the dreams that she had for herself. We're going to make a film about a girl that's sad and lonely, and begging down upon her bending knee, I'll play the part that I won't need rehearsing. All I gotta do is act naturally.
All I got to do is act naturally. By the way, one of probably the most heard songs in the world. It's just one of those, even people go, oh, I've never heard it. You've probably heard it. It's in movies. It's just a famous song, even if you can't name it right off the bat. But if there's a soundtrack that goes with Betty's life, she happens to have been the one to have recorded it, not knowing at the time that she was recording it. It's just, these things, people go out into this world, and they attempt some of these tough industries, and that's what Betty did, went out to LA and worked to have a career in entertainment. And, it's tough hearing the lyrics,
Well, yeah. And again, just in hindsight, but we promised you that we would bring Anthony back into the fold. And
yes,
I love this part of the story. There is this story that you tell in your article, and I'm getting a little emotional, even just like thinking about it, about, Betty's old friend that just melts and breaks my heart all at once. And I'm just going to give it to you. Can you tell us about what we're talking about?
Oh gosh. So I was looking, not as a journalist, but as just a human being. I was looking for where is the glimmer of hope in this story, or where is the heart, and how does this end? It ends with Betty being a mother and a grandmother raped and murdered on the streets of Santa Ana. Are you sure? Is that really how it ends? And while Betty's story is still actively unfolding, one thing that her post office pal, Betty's post office friend, who still lives in the Santa Ana area today, a little bit older, he's not 18 anymore, but just as sweet, because I met him not long ago, and I met him for this Los Angeles Magazine article, and I talked to Anthony, the young man from the post office, the record collector, the music junkie, and he told me this amazing story that makes Liam cry and makes me cry. And essentially, Anthony told me, he said the last time he saw Betty was just a few years ago, just like 2 years before her murder. And Anthony had Betty on his mind. She had left the Postal Service in the 1990s. He only retired a few years ago. So we're 2023 now. So he didn't retire until about 2017, 2018 or so. So Anthony was just wondering where Betty had been, and he learned that she hung out at this one area, this one park, and she had learned that she was homeless and she was unhoused, and he had been, you remember in 1980, I told you, Liam, that he was collecting her music, and that was in the record form. Well, now he had taken so many of those records, not just of Betty Willis, but of other people, other artists, and he had started this YouTube channel, because that's what you do, right? We talked about moving on with the times. He had uploaded all this unheard vinyl onto a YouTube channel, and so now people across the world, they were now hearing Betty's music,
and for the very first time, too.
Correct. Yeah, Liam brings up a great point. While these records did end up in certain parts of the world, music was more regional back then, and things didn't always take off the way that they do now. You couldn't trend the way you do now back then, and not everyone could hear you at the same time. And so he basically, Anthony, the old colleague, the old postal worker, got Betty's music out on YouTube. And there's now one person who hadn't heard about this. And maybe the one person who hadn't heard enough of Betty Willis that they should have heard, and that was Betty Willis. So Anthony felt that it was his duty, and sometimes us music fans get like this. We're like, we need to tell so-and-so just what, look at your music, look at what it's doing, It's like, impacting people around the world. And so Anthony was, now he's in his, late 40s, early 50s. Sorry, Anthony. But that's where Anthony is now. And still looking great, by the way. And Anthony was able to, he found out where Betty was staying. And so he went to his computer and he did all these screenshots, screen captures, and printouts of like how much Betty's records were going for on eBay, because they're rare and they're Betty Willis recordings and they're Phil Spector recordings. And so essentially he got all these printouts, and he was now determined to find his friend, because remember what connected Betty and Anthony in the first place? It was the music. It was the music. And it sparked this thing in Betty. And Anthony, his excitement has not dwindled down one bit. He is remixed and recharged, and he's ready to go find Betty. So that's what he does. A few years before Betty's death, he goes and he finds Betty at a park in the Santa Ana area. And he basically rolls up and he finds this woman, and he's like, are you, once again, we're back to Betty Willis, is that you, Betty? And she looks up and she smiles, and he's like, oh, that's Betty. And so he gets out of his car and he goes,
shades on, if I remember
still with
correctly,
the shades on,
right?
yes, still has the shades on that she wore indoors and outdoors. And so there she is, and they're just talking and chatting, and Anthony made sure he didn't have a desire or interest or any point in mentioning, wait, you're homeless? What's going on here? What's the, sometimes in life you just have to hit the fast forward button and, just get to the point. Don't try and get caught up in the whole trying to understand everything. So he just skipped right past the whole, what are you doing here in a park? He just went right to what he knew, which was Betty and music. And he said, come in the car. I want you to hear something. And Anthony took Betty into his vehicle, and they're sitting there, and he's like, I want you to hear this. And he had a burned CD, for those of you who remember mixing CDs back in the day. And he put in a CD, and he had put together, again, he had all these printouts for Betty to see, just so she could see the impact that she had in her life and in music. And he showed her all the printouts of where her music had gone in this lifetime. And he said, I want you to hear this. And he put the CD in. I was about to say record. He put the CD in, and the first track that he had mixed on the CD was Act Naturally, so that Betty could hear it. And so these two people who first met back in the summer of 1980, now they are here again in 2016 or so, and a little bit older, no longer back at the post office, but there's that same song again, that same old song, and there's that same old smile, Betty. And Betty still had her sunglasses on while she was in the passenger seat of the car, and Anthony is sitting in the driver's seat, just kind of playing the music, doing what he knows how to do as a fan, which is just be excited about the music. And they're sitting there listening to, they were going to put me in the movies, they were going to make a big star out of me, they're going to make a film about a girl that's sad and lonely, all I've got to do is act naturally. The same song that they first came together and sang randomly at that post office in Santa Ana. And Anthony doesn't know what to do because he's getting a little emotional. So he looks over at Betty, even though she had her shades on. And again, this is just a couple of years before Betty's passing. Even though she had her shades on, something she couldn't hide as the music rang out on the speakers. And it was so special because Anthony told me that he looked over and he saw this tear coming down Betty's cheek. And he didn't say anything. And he's just kind of, they're listening to this music that this woman recorded in the 1960s at Gold Star Studios in Hollywood. And he said that there's one thing that Betty said, and she didn't really say it necessarily to anyone, Liam. She said it kind of just as she stared straight out the window at the park that they were parked in front of. And she just looked out the window and she said, damn, this is so good. This music is so good. And the really special part, Liam, is that's, I think, what Anthony was trying to remind her of and prove to her all along, that, God, Betty, your music and your voice is so good.
Man, that story is so good. And that gets me. Every time I read that, I was like, Liam, pull it back together. Pull it back together.
Yeah. Can we do a toast to Betty? We should do a cheers.
Toast to Betty. Absolutely.
Toast to everyone. Raise your glass to Betty Jane Willis. Yep. Act naturally, everybody.
She deserves it. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Joseph. And that is all that we have for you this week. Joseph, thank you so much for coming on this week and for your work sharing Betty's story, and you really, for the first time among pretty much anybody.
Well, you are so welcome. Thank you for having me. You and a few other podcasters out there have done a great job at highlighting Betty Willis' story. So thank you for telling her story. She deserves it.
Well, tell everyone where they can find you and your work, and also, all of the, amazing Betty stories that you've written over the years online.
Absolutely. The best place to go, and I know you'll link to this, but I'll spell it out anyway. Joseph Fenity, Fenity, josephfenity.com/Betty. Go there, and that's kind of the central source and the central hub for the soul of Betty Willis and Betty's story. And then, of course, I know a lot of you are on TikTok and Instagram. I'm not very good at that, but you're welcome to join me at the old school places like Twitter. Remember that thing? @Fenity, @Fenity. Remember that one? Are you there? Are you blocked yet? Are you banned and reported?
No, not yet. I'm close to it though. Every day.
All right, blocked and reported. But I am @Fenity on Twitter, and then Facebook. /Fenity, Fenity. So join me at Fenity on those two things. And then, of course, you can see Betty's story at josephfenity.com. And I cannot believe that I just did Crime Over Wine. This is so fun, Leo.
Oh, this was so fun. Thank you so much for coming on.
For inviting myself, because that's what I did.
You know what? Sometimes we have to invite ourselves. You know what I mean? And I'm so glad you did. I'm so glad you slid into my DMs to tell me about Betty's story, because otherwise I probably would have found out about it. And it was really a story that touched my heart. So thank you so much, Joseph. I really can't thank you enough.
You are so cool. Thank you for having me, Liam.
Well, thank you again so much for coming on, and thank you all so much for listening throughout these last 10 episodes. If you are enjoying this podcast and are just wondering, how can I tell anyone and everyone about it, the single best way to do that is to leave us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening, and also leave us a review. It is the best way to help true crime and wine friends discover this podcast. We are going to put all of our sources on our website so you can read everything for yourself and probably come up with a few theories too. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and we will see you next week for another episode of Crime Over Wine.
Proud member of the Podnuga Network.
Hey, it's Amy Brown from The Bobby Bone Show. Join me in supporting St. Jude Children's Research Hospital for a chance to win a trip to meet Megan Maroney at the 2025 iHeart Country Festival in Austin, Texas on May 3rd, hosted by Bobby Bones. We're going to hook you up with tickets, flights, hotel, food credits, and a meet and greet with Megan Maroney. Take action now to support St. Jude and help cure childhood cancer, and you're going to be entered for a chance to win. Visit iHeartCountryTrip.com to learn more.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.